My daughter-in-law spent 13 years turning my own son into a stranger, but the day I sold my company for $15 million, she smiled at me like I was family again. I noticed it the moment I stepped into their house that afternoon. The way Sophia's voice softened, the way she suddenly stood up to greet me instead of staying seated like she usually did, as if respect could be turned on and off like a light switch. Daniel was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, the same way he had for years whenever I visited, avoiding eye contact, keeping conversations short, always somewhere else even when he was standing right in front of me. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when my son would call me every Sunday morning, when he would ask for my advice before making decisions, when he still looked at me like I mattered. But that was before Sophia learned how to speak for him, how to answer questions that weren't hers, how to slowly rewrite the space I used to occupy in his life. I took a seat at the dining table, the same table I had paid for a decade ago, running my fingers lightly across the polished wood as Sophia poured me coffee without asking how I liked it, as if even my preferences had been erased over time. "We heard about the sale," she said, placing the cup in front of me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. $15 million. It sounded larger when someone else said it out loud, heavier, more real, like a number that suddenly gave me weight in a room where I had felt invisible for far too long. Daniel finally walked in then, wiping his hands on a towel, glancing at me briefly before looking at Sophia, waiting, as if she would decide what he should say next. "Mom," he said, the word unfamiliar on his tongue, like something he hadn't practiced in years. I nodded, keeping my expression calm, my voice steady, the way I had learned to be over time, because reacting never changed anything, and silence often revealed more than words ever could. For 13 years, I had watched this happen piece by piece, small moments that didn't seem like much on their own but added up to something undeniable, something irreversible. And now, sitting there with a cup of coffee I didn't ask for, in a house that used to feel like home, I realized something simple, something I should have understood a long time ago. Sophia didn't change my son overnight. She just waited until he stopped remembering who I was. I did not ask what they planned to do with the money, and they did not offer to tell me, but I could see it in the way Sophia leaned slightly forward in her chair, her fingers wrapped around her glass a little too tightly, her attention fixed on me in a way it had not been in years, as if I had suddenly become interesting again. It was a familiar feeling, just reversed. For more than a decade, I had been the one leaning in, the one trying to hold conversations together, asking Daniel about his work, his health, his life, only to receive short answers and distracted nods while Sophia redirected the conversation to something else, something that did not include me. I remembered a Sunday afternoon, years ago, when I had brought over a homemade apple pie, still warm, the way Daniel used to like it when he was younger. He had barely taken a bite before Sophia mentioned they were cutting back on sugar, and just like that, the pie stayed untouched on the counter, cooling slowly as the conversation shifted away from me. It had seemed small at the time, almost insignificant, but moments like that had a way of stacking up, quietly, until they formed something solid enough to stand on. I took a sip of the coffee she had given me, noticing it was too bitter, not the way I preferred, but I said nothing, because correcting her would not change anything, and I had learned long ago that my preferences were no longer part of this household. "It must feel good," Sophia said, her voice light, almost casual, but there was something underneath it, something measured. "Selling something you built from nothing." I nodded once, setting the cup down carefully, my movements slow, deliberate, because I could feel both of them watching me now, waiting, calculating. Daniel finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me, closer than he had been in years, his posture more open, his expression softer, as if proximity alone could repair what had been worn down over time. "You should not be alone anymore," he said, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was kind, but because it was so predictable. For 13 years, I had been too much, too involved, too present, and now suddenly, I was alone. I looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the boy I had raised, the one who used to run into my arms without hesitation, but all I saw was a man who had learned to measure his words based on who was listening. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised even me. They were not interested in reconnecting with me. They were interested in what had finally made me visible again. I did not stay long after that conversation, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in silence over the past 13 years. And as I stood to leave, Sophia walked me to the door, her hand lightly touching my arm in a gesture that would have felt warm if I had not known how easily it could disappear again. The air outside was cool, the kind that made you breathe a little deeper without thinking, and as I walked to my car, I realized how quiet everything felt when I was not trying to hold a place where I no longer belonged. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, the same room where I had once helped Daniel with his homework, where we had celebrated birthdays with store-bought cakes and paper decorations, where life had felt simple and honest. The walls had not changed, the furniture was still in the same place, but the meaning of everything had shifted slowly over time, almost without me noticing. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down, letting the stillness settle around me. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to replay things without making excuses for anyone. Not for Sophia, and not for Daniel. I remembered the first time I felt something was off. The way Sophia had answered a question I had asked my son, her tone polite but firm, as if she was helping him, as if he needed her to speak for him. I had laughed it off back then, telling myself it was just a new marriage finding its rhythm. Then came the missed calls, the delayed replies, the holidays that became too busy to attend, the small decisions that no longer included me. Each moment had seemed reasonable on its own, easy to explain, easy to forgive, until they became a pattern that I could no longer ignore. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street, and I realized that what I had been holding on to was not what existed, but what used to exist. The version of my son who needed me, who chose me, who remembered me without being reminded. That version was gone, not suddenly, but gradually, replaced piece by piece until there was nothing left to recognize. I rested my hand against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my palm, and I made a decision that felt both heavy and clear at the same time. I would not ask for a place in their lives anymore. Not because I did not care, but because I finally understood that staying where you are not valued is not loyalty, it is quiet self-betrayal. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind no longer felt crowded with questions I could not answer, and there was a quiet clarity in that which I had not felt in years. I made my coffee the way I liked it, measured, familiar, exactly right, and I sat at the kitchen table without turning on the television, without reaching for my phone, just listening to the stillness of my own home. It was not lonely the way it used to be. It felt honest. After a while, I stood up and walked into my study, the one place that had always remained mine no matter what changed outside of it. And I looked at the framed documents on the wall, the early contracts, the photographs from the first years of the company, when everything had depended on long hours and careful decisions. I had built something real, something that required discipline and patience, and I had protected it for decades without realizing that I had not extended that same protection to myself. I sat down at my desk and opened the folder my attorney had given me the week before, the final documents from the sale, each page clean and precise, every number accounted for, every detail in its proper place. $15 million was not just a number. It was a lifetime of work translated into something tangible, something that could be controlled, directed, protected. I turned the pages slowly, not because I needed to read them again, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what I still owned, what had never been taken from me. Then I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had not used in a long time. My attorney answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar, someone who had never treated me as if I needed to be spoken for. I told him I wanted to make changes, not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of understanding, and there was a pause on the other end of the line, not of surprise, but of recognition. He did not ask why. He only asked when I would like to begin. I looked around the room once more, at the life I had built with my own hands, and for the first time, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I still had, and what I intended to keep. We met 2 days later in his office, a quiet space on the 23rd floor overlooking a stretch of downtown that had changed as much as my own life had. New buildings rising where old ones once stood, everything looking modern and polished from a distance, while the foundations beneath remained unseen. My attorney greeted me with the same calm professionalism he always had, offering me a seat without unnecessary conversation, as if he understood that this was not about emotion, but about clarity. He laid out the documents in front of me one by one, explaining each option in precise language, trusts, allocations, restrictions, all the ways ownership could be structured to protect what mattered. I listened carefully, asking only what was necessary, because this was not a moment for hesitation. This was a moment for intention. You can make it inaccessible, he said at one point, tapping lightly on a section of the document, or you can make it conditional. I looked at the page, at the clean lines of legal language that held more power than any argument ever could, and I thought about the past 13 years, about every small shift that had been explained away until it became permanent. No conditions, I said quietly. Just clarity. He nodded once, making a note, not surprised, not questioning, simply adjusting the structure to reflect a decision that had already been made long before I walked into that room. As we moved through the paperwork, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not even relief, but something steadier, something that did not depend on anyone else's approval. By the time we reached the final page, he placed a pen in front of me and paused, giving me the space to reconsider if I needed it. I did not. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, the same way I had signed the first contract of my company decades ago, aware that this, too, was a beginning, not an end. When I finished, he gathered the documents neatly, securing them in a folder that would not leave his office without protection, without purpose. It is done, he said, and there was no emphasis in his voice, no drama, just a statement of fact. I stood up, smoothing my hands over the edge of the desk for a brief moment, grounding myself in the simplicity of the action. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware of what had just shifted inside that room, unaware that something invisible but irreversible had taken place. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like I was reacting to what had been done to me. I felt like I had finally decided what would not be done to me anymore. 3 days passed before Daniel called me, and when I saw his name appear on my phone screen, I let it ring once longer than usual before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to feel the moment fully, to recognize it for what it was rather than what I once hoped it might be. His voice sounded different, lighter, almost careful, as if he was choosing each word before it reached me. "Mom, we were thinking," he began, and I could already hear the echo of another voice behind his, shaping the sentence before he finished it. "Maybe you should come over this weekend. We could have dinner, talk about everything." Everything. It was a broad word, one that could mean anything or nothing at all, depending on how it was used. I agreed without adding more, setting a time, keeping my tone even, because there was no reason to complicate what had already been decided. When I arrived that Saturday evening, the house felt different again, but not in the way it used to when I walked in and tried to make myself fit into the space. This time, I simply observed. The table was set more carefully than usual, 3 plates aligned neatly, the lighting softer, the atmosphere almost intentional. Sophia greeted me at the door with that same practiced warmth, her smile precise, her posture open, as if she had rehearsed the moment. "We made your favorite," she said, stepping aside to let me in, and I noticed the way she watched my reaction, measuring it, waiting for approval. I thanked her politely and took my seat, my movements steady, my attention quiet but focused. Daniel sat across from me, leaning forward slightly, engaged in a way that might have meant something years ago, but now felt more like an effort than a habit. The conversation started easily enough, small talk about the weather, about the city, about things that required no history and no honesty, and I let it unfold without interruption. It was not until halfway through the meal that Sophia placed her fork down gently and looked at me with a seriousness that had been carefully timed. "We have been talking," she said, her voice calm, controlled, "and we think it might be better if you did not stay alone anymore." I met her gaze without reacting, not because the suggestion was unexpected, but because I had already heard it before, just in different words, in different tones, always carrying the same intention beneath it. Daniel nodded beside her, his agreement quiet but present, and for a moment, the room felt very still, as if it was waiting for me to respond the way I always had. But this time, I did not rush to fill the silence. I simply sat there, looking at both of them, understanding not just what they were saying, but why they were saying it now, and that made all the difference. "That will not be necessary," I said quietly, and the words seemed to settle into the room in a way that made both of them pause, not because I raised my voice, but because I did not. Sophia blinked once, her expression holding for just a second too long before she adjusted it back into something polite, something composed. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, as if he had expected resistance, but not this kind of calm refusal, not this absence of explanation. "Mom, we just think," he started, but I lifted my hand gently, not to interrupt him, but to make it clear that I had already understood what he was trying to say. "I know what you think," I replied, keeping my tone even, almost soft, because this was not a conversation I needed to win, it was simply one I needed to end correctly. The silence that followed was different from the ones we had shared before, not filled with discomfort or uncertainty, but with something more defined, something that no longer required me to fill the space for them. Sophia folded her hands together on the table, her posture still composed, but there was a slight tension in the way her fingers pressed against each other, a subtle shift that might have gone unnoticed years ago. "We just want what is best for you," she said, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small smile, not out of warmth, but out of recognition. That sentence had been used in many forms over the years, always presented as care, always carrying something else beneath it. I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them, because understanding and agreement were not the same thing. Daniel looked between us, his gaze moving from her to me and back again, as if he was trying to find his place in a conversation that no longer followed the pattern he was used to. "Things can be different now," he added, his voice quieter, almost uncertain, and I wondered briefly if he believed that, or if he simply needed to say it. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip, giving myself a moment before responding, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted the moment to be clear, unhurried. "Different is not the same as better," I said, setting the glass down with care, the sound soft but precise against the table. Neither of them spoke after that. The room held its stillness again, but this time, it did not belong to them. It belonged to me, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like I was sitting at their table. I felt like I was simply passing through it. After that, the conversation did not recover, not because anything dramatic happened, but because there was nothing left to smooth over, no familiar pattern to fall back into, and I could see it in the way Sophia shifted slightly in her seat, recalibrating, searching for a different approach that would bring things back under her control. "Of course," she said after a moment, her tone still even, but more careful now. "We just thought it might be easier for everyone." Easier. It was always about what was easier, what was more convenient, what required the least resistance, and for years, I had been the one adjusting to make that possible. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate, a small, deliberate action that gave me something steady to focus on while the silence stretched between us again. Daniel cleared his throat, glancing at Sophia briefly before looking back at me, and I noticed the hesitation there, the uncertainty that had not been present before. "We could help manage things," he added, his voice quieter, as if he was testing the idea rather than stating it, and that was when everything became clear in a way that did not require explanation. Manage things. Not visit more often. Not reconnect. Not rebuild what had been lost. Manage. I leaned back slightly in my chair, studying both of them without urgency, without the need to respond immediately, because for the first time, I was not reacting to their words, I was observing the intention behind them. Sophia held her posture steady, but there was a flicker in her eyes now, something sharper, something that revealed more than her tone ever would. She was not asking. She was positioning. Daniel, on the other hand, looked between us again, his expression caught somewhere between agreement and discomfort, as if he could sense that something had shifted but did not yet understand what it meant. I let a few seconds pass before speaking, not to create tension, but because I no longer felt the need to rush through moments that deserved clarity. "Everything is already managed," I said simply, my voice calm, without emphasis, because the truth did not need to be raised to be heard. Sophia's expression stilled completely for just a fraction of a second, and in that pause, I saw the first crack, not in her composure, but in her certainty. Daniel frowned slightly, leaning forward again, his attention sharper now, no longer distant. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I met his gaze directly, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with something far more final. I mean, I replied, there is nothing left that needs your help. The words did not carry anger, but they carried something else, something far more difficult to dismiss. And as the silence settled once more, I realized that for the first time in 13 years, they were the ones trying to understand me, and I was no longer offering explanations. Daniel did not respond right away, and that was when I knew the moment had finally reached him. Not the words themselves, but the absence of anything familiar to hold on to. The realization that this conversation was not following the script he had grown comfortable with. He looked at Sophia again, almost instinctively, as if waiting for her to step in, to clarify, to reshape what had just been said into something easier to accept. But this time, she did not move as quickly. Her composure remained, but it was no longer effortless, and I could see the calculation behind her stillness, the way she was reassessing, adjusting, trying to understand what had changed without being told directly. You already made arrangements? Daniel asked finally, his voice quieter now, more careful, and I nodded once, not adding more, because the answer itself was simple, even if its implications were not. He leaned back in his chair again, his expression tightening slightly, not with anger, but with something closer to confusion, as if a piece of information had been removed from a structure he thought he understood. Why would you do that without telling us? He continued, and there it was not. Concern, not curiosity, but expectation, the assumption that he should have been included, that he had a place in decisions that, for years, had quietly excluded me. I folded my hands in my lap, resting them there calmly, because this question did not require defense, only clarity. Because it did not involve you, I said, my tone steady, not cold, not sharp, just direct, and the effect was immediate. Sophia's eyes shifted slightly, just enough to reveal that the answer had landed exactly where it needed to, and Daniel's expression stilled in a way I had not seen before, as if he was trying to reconcile the person sitting in front of him with the version of me he had come to expect. The room felt smaller then, not physically, but in the way that happens when something unspoken finally becomes undeniable. No one reached for their glass. No one moved their plate. Even the small background sounds of the house seemed to fade, leaving only the weight of what had just been said. Sophia straightened slightly in her chair, her posture returning to something more controlled, more deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but more precise. We just thought you would want family involved in something like that, she said, and I looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, not to challenge her, but to let the truth settle between us without interruption. Family is not defined by involvement. I replied, my voice quiet, measured. It is defined by presence. Neither of them spoke after that, and in the silence that followed, I understood something with complete certainty. They were not upset because they cared about me. They were unsettled because, for the first time, they had no influence over what I had chosen to do. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when something familiar no longer fits, and I could see him trying to rearrange his understanding of the situation, searching for a version of this conversation where he still had a place he recognized. Sophia, however, did not retreat. She adjusted. I watched it happen in real time. The way her shoulders squared slightly, the way her expression softened just enough to appear reasonable, cooperative, as if the tone of the conversation could still be guided back into something manageable. We are not trying to control anything, she said gently, her voice steady, carefully measured. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, especially with something that large. Something that large. The words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. I let them sit there, not challenging them, not correcting them, because sometimes the truth reveals itself more clearly when it is left untouched. I reached for my glass again, taking a small sip, my movements unhurried, because I no longer felt the need to respond on their timeline. It is handled, I said simply, setting the glass down with the same quiet precision as before. Sophia nodded slowly, but her eyes did not match the gesture. There was something sharper behind them now, something more focused, as if she was narrowing in on the one thing that still mattered to her. Of course, she replied, but things like this can be complicated. There are taxes, long-term planning, decisions that affect the whole family. The whole family. I looked at her then, really looked at her, not with frustration, not with disbelief, but with a kind of clarity that made everything else unnecessary. For years, I had tried to understand her words, to interpret them in ways that allowed for kindness, for misunderstanding, for the possibility that I was simply seeing things incorrectly. But now, there was nothing left to interpret. Daniel shifted in his seat, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his fingers tapping lightly, a small, restless motion that betrayed the calm he was trying to maintain. "Maybe we could sit down with your attorney," he added, his voice quieter now, almost cautious, "just to go over everything together." I let a brief silence follow, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted them to hear the space between their words and my response. "That will not be necessary," I said again, my tone unchanged, steady, final. This time, there was no immediate reply. Sophia's expression stilled completely, her composure intact, but no longer fluid, and Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to the table before lifting again, as if he was beginning to see something he had not expected to find. The room felt different now, not tense, not loud, but unmistakably altered, like a door that had been quietly closed without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. And in that moment, I understood that this was not about convincing them of anything. It was about allowing them to finally understand that they no longer had a say. Daniel's hands stopped moving after that, resting flat against the table, as if even the smallest gesture might disrupt whatever was unfolding in front of him. And for a moment, he did not look at either of us, his gaze fixed somewhere between the surface of the wood and the space just beyond it, as though he was trying to locate something that had quietly slipped out of reach. Sophia was the first to move again, but it was subtle, a slight shift in posture, a controlled inhale, the kind of adjustment that comes when someone realizes the approach they have relied on is no longer effective. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, her voice still calm, but no longer as soft as before, the edges of it more defined now, more deliberate. I met her eyes without changing my expression, not because I wanted to challenge her, but because there was nothing left to soften. "It is not complicated," I replied, my tone even, almost quiet. "It is simply not yours to manage." The words settled between us with a clarity that did not need emphasis, and for the first time, Sophia did not respond immediately. Daniel looked up then, his expression shifting in a way that felt unfamiliar, not defensive, not distant, but unsettled, as if something he had accepted for years was being presented to him in a different light. "Mom," he said slowly, and there was a hesitation there, a pause that had not existed before. "We just thought we were part of this." I held his gaze for a moment, long enough to let the question behind his words surface fully, not the one he had asked, but the one he had not. "You were not," I said, not with harshness, not with disappointment, but with a kind of steadiness that did not allow for reinterpretation. The silence that followed was heavier than the ones before, not because of tension, but because of recognition. Sophia's composure held, but it no longer concealed the shift beneath it, and Daniel's expression remained still, as if he was processing something that could not be undone by explanation. No one reached for their food. No one attempted to redirect the conversation. The moment did not need to be guided anywhere else. After a while, I stood up, smoothing my hands lightly against the edge of the table, a simple motion that marked the end of something without needing to announce it. "I should be going," I said, my voice calm, measured, and neither of them tried to stop me. Daniel rose a second later, almost automatically, but he did not step forward, did not reach out, as if he was unsure what that gesture would mean now. Sophia remained seated for a brief moment before standing as well, her movements precise, controlled, but no longer effortless. I walked toward the door without rushing, without hesitation, and as I reached for the handle, I realized that nothing in that house felt unfinished anymore. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be. The drive home felt different that night, not because the roads had changed or the distance was any shorter, but because for the first time in years, I was not replaying conversations in my head, not searching for better words, not wondering if I could have handled things differently. The silence inside the car was steady, almost comforting, like something that no longer needed to be filled. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking at the house in front of me, the place that had never asked me to be anything other than who I was. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing briefly before fading into the quiet, and I realized how different this silence felt from the kind I used to carry with me after visiting them. This was not emptiness. This was space. I walked into the living room and set my keys down on the table, the same table where I had once sorted through school papers and birthday invitations, where life had been full in a way that did not require explanation. Everything was still where it belonged, unchanged, undisturbed, and for the first time, I understood that nothing had ever been taken from me that I had not slowly allowed to be diminished. I moved toward the window and looked out at the street, the same quiet stretch of pavement that had witnessed years of comings and goings, small moments that once felt ordinary but now carried a kind of clarity I had never noticed before. My phone remained silent, and I did not expect it to ring. Not that night, and not the next day. And for once, I did not feel the need to reach for it. Days passed, then a week, and the distance settled into something real, something that no longer felt like waiting, but like acceptance. I returned to my routines without effort, morning coffee, evening walks, small decisions made without considering how they might be received by anyone else. And somewhere in that quiet rhythm, I found something I had not realized I had been missing. Not control, not validation, but a sense of self that did not depend on being included. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk reviewing a few final documents, I paused and allowed myself to reflect, not on what had gone wrong, but on what had finally gone right. I had not lost my son in a single moment. I had watched him drift away, step by step, until there was nothing left to hold on to. And yet, I had stayed, hoping that something would return on its own. It never did. But what I had done, quietly, without confrontation, without resentment, was step out of a place where I was no longer seen and into a life that did not require permission to exist. I did not take anything from them. I did not need to. They had already chosen what mattered to them. I simply chose differently. And in the end, they did not lose money. They lost the one person who had never asked for anything in return.